Hello, SRFC. So, with us today, we have award-winning author Jeanette Ng, who was with us at SRFC a couple of years ago when her novel Under the Pendulum Sun was first published and came to talk to us about it. But she's also agreed very kindly to do a bit of an interview with us as part of our lockdown YouTube channel. Welcome, Jeanette. How is lockdown treating you?
Surprisingly kindly, or not very. I have a dog now, so the dog is transforming me into a very positive, preppy person who also is awake in the mornings, which I did not expect.
Wow.
We made the mistake of feeding her in the morning, so she wakes me up now at 7 on the dot, regardless of how much sleep I've had the night before. So I don't really have a choice about being a morning person. And then when you learn about dog training, it's all about positive reinforcement. So I'm very good at sounding enthusiastic now.
Yeah, pets kind of have their own time frames and timetables. So if my cat comes and joins us during this, it's just a thing. He likes showing his bum to people. So he's
taking a photo.
It's a thing. It's a thing. My colleagues love him now. He's a bit of a fixture. So it's been a couple of years since Pendulum Sun came out, but it's such a fantastically interesting novel. I mean, to do a fantasy gothic novel was really unusual, and I'm not sure I've come across any or many other examples. And I think the use of form is so fascinating here. So why gothic novels?
I didn't watch all of it. I mean, Jane Eyre was, I think, the first novel I read, like first chunky book I read. I think I said once that I knew about like 10% of the words in it or something like that. I read it whilst copying out all the words I didn't know, like the penetrating rain and so forth, like into a little notebook, and I had to look it all up in a dictionary, which probably shows how old I am. And I think in some ways, a lot of the little phrases in Jane Eyre, I think, just lodged into my developing my brain at that point. Sometimes I think the little verbal echoes come from that time when I was just copying bits of it out and absorbing the style of its prose. Sounds very pretentious. Gothic novels. I love fantasy, and I got asking myself one day, how you would do the gothic and the fantasy at the same time, because the big thing about fantasy novels is that magic is real, and the big thing about gothic novels is that uncertainty, that sense of creeping dread, and a lot of that dread, much like with cosmic horror, comes from not knowing your place in the world, not knowing, like, not being certain about yourself, not knowing if the supernatural is real, and the kind of, what's behind the curtain in Mysteries of Udolpho, or like, is there really a ghost in Jane Eyre? And very often the twist is, surprise, the terrible thing was not a ghost, but a person, and the person was terrible. And the true horror is humanity, which, it always sounds very cliche when you put it like that, but that is the heart of a lot of Gothic. And sometimes there are actual monsters, obviously, but in fantasy, the magic needs to be real and kind of confirmed. That's what you're there for, that kind of sense of wonder and dread, sort of like, oh yes, magic, 100% absolutely real. So I wanted to kind of have both of those things. Like, can you have the cake, keeping the cake and eating the cake at the same time? And Pendulum Sun was my answer to how to do that, which is to make magic very uncertain. So Fairy Realm was a lot about how you just don't really know what is, like, rules just aren't laid out. It came out around the same time as my book. Cruel Prince by Holly Black also has a fairyland in which salt is a sort of like an antidote to enchantment. But in that, and this isn't to say her book is bad by any stretch of the imagination, but in her book it's very clear. You eat fairy fruit, bad things happen. You're basically it's basically like a date rape drug. You feel woozy, you're very drunk, you're very susceptible to influences, and people can tell you to do stupid things and you'll do it, and you lose all sense of control. It's quite horrible. And salt will magically cure you of it, and it's very not transactional, but it's very clearly laid out. That's what happens. And in Pendulum Sun, kind of leaning into the Gothic horror, is that bad things happen when you eat fairy food, and salt will make that go away. Will nullify that. Will make it safe to eat. But what exactly is the bad thing that happens? You never quite find out, and you never quite know precisely. And that's kind of the uncertainty that makes it scary. That and that everyone is scared.
Because it's a really claustrophobic book, because you've got something that's focused on Victorian missionaries. They are going to fairyland to try and convert the population to Christianity. They have permission to build this mission, but it's very claustrophobic. All of the action in the book takes place in this very mysterious Gothic castle, and there's this kind of mysterious fairyland all around it, and you have the Queen of the Fae kind of coming in and creating chaos, and it has that kind of sinister claustrophobia but within it. But I loved as well within it all of these, what feel like all these nods to other bits of Gothic novels. I was kind of going off, kind of spotting all of the Easter eggs and the connections, because you've mentioned Jane Eyre, and there is a lot of that, but I was also spotting bits of Wuthering Heights,
yes,
and Rebecca, particularly with mysterious housekeepers and kind of strange relationships. And that must have been great fun to kind of pack those references in. Do you have a particular favourite?
I think Wuthering Heights would be my favourite. But yeah, I think I would say Wuthering Heights. It's not a coincidence that a heroine is called Kathy for that reason. And I think I like Wuthering Heights because of that kind of destructive passions, and that they're not an idealized relationship. They're everything's just very terrible, and it ends very poorly for them. Or maybe not. Maybe that's. And I love the landscape of it, the moors. I want it to be very, because you mentioned all these Easter eggs to Gothic novels. I think what I like is it's always just going to do the big obvious structural ones. I kind of crept in because I don't know how to structure anything for shit, so I ended up going, oh well, it's kind of like Jane Eyre, or like the latter third of Jane Eyre, so I'm just going to lean into that a little bit harder. But there are all these little other Easter eggs which I hope some people notice. Things like Birdforth is a real place in Yorkshire. It's not very big. It's got it's a village with I think last census was 11 people lived there. But it has a little church, has a little Norman church, which you can go to if you kind of go get the keys from the cafe. It's really lovely, and it's completely whitewashed. And I wanted. So I was like, yes, I want this location in my book. And it's just a wonderful name. I love the words Birdforth, which is in the book where Kathy and Leon grew up. There are all these kind of... I wanted to sort of have some of the slightly... the door that leads to nowhere. I found out afterwards that Winchester Mystery House also has one, but mine is actually a reference to... Mysteries of Udolpho, where the whole thing about it, kind of the lock coming open, is again it's a plot point in Mysteries of Udolpho, which is Anne Radcliffe, the progenitor of the Gothic novel form. So there's this. I kind of play with some of the more obscure things there, and there's a whole kind of hinted at subplot about the identity of the salamander, who is of course the snake, the serpent from the Bible, which never gets spelt out, and I always kind of enjoy telling people that, because it's kind of 50-50 if people picked up on that. And people who pick up on them, I will be rolling their eyes at me, going I can't believe you thought it would be difficult, and I'm like, oh well.
It's funny.
I did better next time.
But those kinds of things, I mean, they kind of add to the appreciation of the book, but they're not essential for reading it and understanding it. It's just kind of little extra bonus pieces that that kind of make it better.
I think it's to me it's sort of like a tree ring of my of all my interests when I was writing it. So anything that I was kind of vaguely interested at the time sort of just finds its way into the book. There's a fairy feast, the kind of feast banquety mask ball scene. That's, I think, in theory, catered by the same people as catered Emma Newman's fairy ball in book 5 of her fairy series, because the caterers for her, because her book is based on a real event that they kind of did in a kind of live role play setting, in Bath. It was a very cool event, and a university friend of mine ran it with her, and my partner and his kind of catering collective that he's part of did the food for that event, and I was at the food testing for the food for that event, so they had the same food, and I was like, oh yes, I will write this fairy food that will be at the fairy ball in Emma Newman's book. I will write the same food into my book, so we will have the same caterers, which is very convoluted. I think, like, I don't actually know if we intersect in terms of the dishes we described in the end. But they couldn't have, I remember thinking at the time, because they couldn't have dried ice at the event, they had various logistical issues. I was like, yes, I will put dried ice in my book, just to make up for the fact that your book couldn't get dried ice. I can't remember what happened in the end.
Because it's a proper
or what I put in
kind of style, magical, fantastical food, and the way the hall is decorated.
Well, it was. I mean, you could just throw a bunch of grapes in your freezer and sprinkle sugar on it. It is that easy. Frozen grapes are great. I highly recommend them,
particularly when it's hot.
Yes, no, they're really good. Amazing snack.
The ball is something that's presided over, and it's thrown in honour of the Queen of the Fae, and you've got this portrayal of the Fae, and you know she is a terrible, beautiful trickster who has all of that charisma and kind of really inspires fear, and she has this court full of creatures and fae. Where did you draw what sources did you draw for your fae court?
So Mab, I can't remember how Mab came into it. Mab just sort of I want to say is just a Mab just arrived in my head. It was just like bam, there she was, and I'm like, yep, that's some writing. But in honesty, I just can't really remember. I think I just wanted her to be kind of scary and commanding, and I wanted descriptions of her to be interesting to read. I don't really have brain pictures the way a lot of people kind of have mental images, so I just wanted them to sound nice to me, to contain words that taste nice on my mouth, and I kind of wrote to that rhythm. But she obviously draws from a lot of sources. Spoilers, she draws from like a lot of Lilith lore, kind of like the demon from that romantics were kind of obsessed with her for a while, as Adam's first wife. The romantics were obsessed with a lot of random things, but that was kind of where that came into the story. And I wanted her to sort of do the thing where she's almost parodying and purposefully, maybe not purposefully, misunderstanding the customs that Kathy is used to in a way that makes Kathy extremely uncomfortable. So I think you could probably call it sort of the literary technique of defamiliarization, kind of is basically what she does, where she takes something that Cathy should be very comfortable with, something from like kind of the Victorian world, but she does it back to Cathy in a way that makes Cathy really uncomfortable because it showcases something in that tradition that Cathy is not comfortable to be confronted about it. Excuse me. The wasp waist, for example, is something like, oh, I'm being confronted by the fact that this tradition, this style of dress is completely ridiculous, and is kind of weird and creepy when you think about it. And then, in fairness, like that applies to both real things which are terrible and also things that are probably not terrible, but someone gave it a really stupid name or it had a really odd comparison at some point. It just kind of stuck around in our lexicon. Or just have like kind of slightly odd names, or just name words changed over time. So she plays on that to sort of make Cathy feel, and by extension the reader, feel uncomfortable. I think one of the things which kind of came up when I'm kind of thinking about the structure of the Gothic was I needed a baseline for the reader to be relatively comfortable with, or at least familiar with, in a way that they understood what the character will think is real or not real, and so they know when to be surprised when the character is surprised, because if it happens in an entirely kind of secondary world fantasy, I just don't have that baseline that I would have to do a lot more work to make sure the reader knows, okay, so when I say the fish is a moon, that's not normal. Or when I say you know, this is what the food tastes like, or you know, you pour rabbit's blood into the stew, that is or isn't normal. And of course the thing is about rabbit's blood and as a stew thickener is that's completely normal. Just normally it's a thing that was very common in Victorian food, but they would do the mixing in the kitchen. You would add it as a stew thickener in the kitchen and cook it first. Much like eating pig's blood, very normal. Blood is a very common food ingredient, but it's kind of squeamish when you see it in front of you on the table. It's kind of matter out of place, and a lot of fairyland presumes you know already where matter should be, otherwise it cannot be out of place. And I kind of hacked it by making it Victorian, because that way a lot of people, the reader would already be familiar with what should or shouldn't be and have that sense of comfort that can be made uncomfortable.
And some of that, it feels like Mab is deliberately doing that to mess with Cathy's head and to kind of amp up that sense of strangeness and being out of place.
And sometimes maybe she's just weird.
Yeah,
we don't know.
And it's something that comes through really strongly in the book, is this sense of strangeness of Cathy and Leon being very out of place and in a strange world, much as you would be as someone who is coming from any different culture and going into a different place and being confronted with different customs and food and rules and everything else. And one of the things I think the novel does really well is kind of plays a bit on that kind of colonial relationship and the preconceptions that Cathy and Leon are going in with, this idea that as Victorian missionaries they know best and they're going to civilize fairyland by bringing it to Christianity, and find themselves just confronted with something that is very equal and very different.
And their faith, you know, their faith is challenged. They have to remake themselves in the face of it. Whether or not that, and I think there's a certain ambiguity in the ending where I don't like saying what I think, because I've encountered so many people with very different interpretations, all of which I support, agree, love. And I've had people tell me they think it's quite a positive, optimistic ending, and there are people who think it's quite like a dark, terrible ending, and it's a choice to live in sin, or maybe they're not living in sin, and it's that kind of lack of, and you know, I have half an English degree. I eat ambiguity for breakfast. I want that, so I very much like that it is very open to interpretation that way. That they have a revelation about themselves, but is it a good revelation? Is unknown. But
they've learned and been changed by their experience. So
they've definitely learned a thing, and they've definitely changed. Just, are they positive changes? I don't. I myself oscillate when I was writing it. I wasn't sure, but I wanted them to be fundamentally changed. And the thing is about Fairyland is that it is very much this journey, not just outside. It's very much an internal journey sort of thing. And it's not very much a problem with missionary novels, missionary books. Is that they're about the missionary, and they're also very much about that internal journey. And in some ways, all fiction can get a bit egocentric that way. That it's always about, like, on some level, it's good. It's good. We like it when stories, the internal journey of the character is reflected in the external world around them. It's pleasing. It gives people like me who like to have English degrees things to talk about. So, and that's very much, for Kathleen Leon, it's very much taken that kind of thing to the logical conclusion, because Fairyland is this kind of box created to challenge them. So that's kind of it's not that they go to a strange place and everything just happens to challenge them and make them reconsider their life choices. It's that it was designed that way, both by me, the author, and by Mab, the scary fairy woman, who is my self-insert character, obviously. And to me, that's kind of that's the kind of pleasing symmetry to it. I like that. And it kind of sidesteps the fact that they don't really have the best of intentions for that. I don't know how, because the thing about fairies is one of the questions in the book asks is, what are fairies? And it's like, by the end of the book, I'm still not sure what fairies are. I can tell you what changeling are, but fairies,
they're definitely very alien. And we see with Mab, I think, I think you say we're seeing the most human focus of the fairy, and the most kind of able to communicate with normal human beings. In that, and there's this kind of whole vast world that we don't get to see because we're not able to see it, because we're not physically capable of traveling and experiencing those parts of your fairyland.
And I don't know how to write anything weirder than Thornian in a book. I suppose I get very disappointed when fairies show up and they're like, oh, they're just people but smaller, or they're just people with wings. And I really wanted them to be really unsettling. Except Miss Davenport, of course, who was a person. And Mr. Benjamin, bless his soul, is...
Oh, I loved Mr. Benjamin.
Who's also very much a person, but he has very idiosyncratic interpretation of events.
One of the things I really loved about the book is that at the start of each chapter you do the thing of quoting bits of text, and it always, I love the way it gives people a chance to kind of bring in bits of world building and history and stuff like that. And a lot of these are kind of newspaper reports and missionary reports back into kind of missionary HQ back in London. So how did you go about preparing those and kind of pulling them in?
So I think the gimmick for them was what they were meant to. So about a decade ago, I had the whole idea of writing the whole missionaries going to fairyland book. Haha, it would be hilarious. And I did that because we were university students. We didn't have a TV. We're very boring people, and the thing we would do for fun is to read to each other from our books. And I was reading this Victorian missionary manual for convoluted reasons to my friends, and we were going, haha, isn't this hilarious? They're so incredibly racist. And what really struck me was how it wasn't even necessarily hateful so much as they couldn't comprehend that the people they were talking to were people. And they described them in a way that perceived them in a way that was so incredibly alien. by the end of it, I was like, they're not talking about humans. They're talking about fae. These are just fairies. I'm just absolute. There's a section in the book where it says, the fairies, they have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, a mouth, and all the things that you'd expect from a human being. I'm like, did you expect something different? Like, why did you think the Chinese would have more or less than 2 legs? And so that kind of, and that of course is in the book as fairies, and I've thought that'd be funny. I say funny in the way of that kind of very dry, terrible academic humor where you're like, oh yes, it's hilarious, that kind of way. And then that's the basis about almost all my world building. I think the ideas fit together in a way that amuse me. And then when I was writing that, because I was reading this missionary manual, I was like, oh yes, I will write it completely in character, and it will just be this kind of collection of papers. And at the time, I wanted it to be basically a single missionary's kind of descent into horror, existential horror, where every single aspect of his existence was like his belief in empire, his belief in materiality, his belief in money, in trade would be broken down. I think around that time there was a scene of him going to a fairy market where his concept of commerce was being challenged, where he was just where it would break down his idea of what things are worth, or that things could even have worth. And so I from right at the start, I had this idea for all these little bits of text that I wanted to do that was kind of from the universe, that was not like the narrator. And that didn't go anywhere. And when I kind of had the idea that I wanted to write a Gothic novel and kind of jam the two ideas together, and I realized that the narrator I wanted for the missionary book was a Gothic heroine, and they kind of just fit together very neatly. So if it feels like there are 2 books in there that kind of got messed up and mixed up together, that's why, because it was 2 books. And I did quite a lot of research early on, and I just kind of recycled a lot of that stuff. In the end, a lot of the texts I think are sort of meant to not foreshadow, but just kind of prepare the reader for ideas that come later. So the sea whale that shows up. There's kind of like a lull in the middle of the book where not a lot happens, and Kathy and Leon are briefly happy. There's a giant whale that shows up, and it's made of wicker, and it's cool. It's there to be cool, and that whale is foreshadowed early on, where there's a little segment that describes it as one of the weird things that you could see in Fairyland. And lots of little bits of world building happen there, partly just to make you more, it also accentuates how small Kathy's world is, so you can see outside of her world without her having to leave the house. And I think in some ways, when I think about the structure of it, I think about it in terms of a series of revelations of what the reader knows, what I want them to be suspecting, and what I want them to know next. So it's kind of this sequence of
gradual reveal.
Of reveals, yeah, like the bam, and now you know this, and now you know this, and here's and these things are foreshadowed, these things are hinted at, and so forth. So those little front piece texts are quite important in kind of just priming the reader to just to put a couple things into their mind before it comes up, and so it seems less surprising. But that's most of them.
And they do a fantastic job of showing how missionaries, as you said, really othered the communities and the places that they were going. And that kind of real narrow perspective that Kathy had from her.
Yeah. And I will add that from my point of view, like one of the kind of problems in my research was I'm very much focused on their interactions with East Asian, specifically Chinese communities, and their interaction with Native communities, African communities were very, very different, because they saw them in very different light, in a way that the Chinese, they were able to view, whilst not entirely human, they had a certain respect for all the crap they had. that they were practicing some flavor of civilization. It's a very different, and of course the spiritual life that existed or didn't exist, depending on who you ask, at China at the time, their relationship with missionaries is very different. And I think my perspective on missionaries consequently is perhaps nicer than a lot of other people would have, because like my gran was a missionary. She was converted, and she was preacher in Hong Kong at the time. For very so I think if I was writing again, I might be a little more harsher, or at least fold in some of those other perspectives that I'm more aware now that I hadn't quite included.
And this is probably a good time to talk about August last year, and this book, of course, is responsible, or the one that prompted you to be nominated for and to win what was the Campbell Award for a new writer. And you gave this incredibly powerful acceptance speech in Dublin last year, drawing attention to a whole host of macro problems around race and culture, and but also within the publishing industry, and particularly with the legacy of Campbell and how it was represented in that award. And not only, I think, was your speech absolutely pivotal in what we now know has turned into the renaming of that award to take away the toxic legacy of a very problematic individual. Your acceptance speech has now been nominated for a Hugo, so potentially in the next few weeks, so you've got as a best related fan work. But looking back now over what's happened since last August, where we've had a huge debate around the conversation around Black Lives Matter, around our cultural and historical frames of reference for, certainly within this country and the UK's place in the world, and kind of starting to engage with its colonial history. It feels like a really prescient speech that you gave last year.
I think you could pick like any moment in time of someone doing something, and it would be important. Like, I feel like one of the things that really gets to me is how we're having these conversations over and over and over again. Like, it always feels like we're having it for the first time, except we're not. Like, I remember, like, when I remember Race Fail happening, which, when all of SFF had our big kind of awakening and finally going like, yes, we'll talk about issues of and at the time, I think we didn't, like, I wasn't part of the community then, but a lot of things that were talked about then, I think we would probably even describe today as cultural appropriation, for example. So we've kind of gained a lot of vocabulary. So it's not like all the time was wasted. But certainly, we've just had so many, like the whole thing with the rabid puppies happened. I came in
speeches as well. She's been talking a lot about the issues in the industry.
Exactly. Like, yeah. We've had, and like, I remember back when web pages were way less shiny and flashy, reading a speech from Ursula Le Guin's blog, where she talks about culture. Writing fantasy and how white fantasy is, and that's not that I helped. I wrote a very white book, but and I find it hard to take credit, and I don't want to take credit for all of that, because it's very easy to pick a moment and say this is the moment when, and it's pleasing. Our brains like narrative, I like narrative, so it's nice to look at that, and then it was easy to pick that moment because I was on a stage and there are recordings of it. You can go watch me kind of bungle my way through that speech on YouTube. But like, even with the renaming of the ward, like it came at a very good time. There was a book that was being written about the Astounding legacy, called Astounding, that came out around the same time, and that kind of did a lot of groundwork to kind of to put to light that the stuff that was happening that we weren't talking about, and I got on stage wanting to say that and kind of say things, but I didn't think it was that controversial. innocently. I just thought I'd just get up there and say it because I thought, we all know it. Um, like, oh, who was it? Like one of our fantasy greats was like writing like columns about how Campbell's a fascist in editorials in British SFF magazines. Like I just didn't. It's even on a Wikipedia page. It's not like it's not some kind of dark secret that you have to really drudge through things to find out. And yet we just still kind of kept having it. And I'm not. And then perhaps it's one of those things about, we don't, fish can't see water kind of thing.
Yeah, it's been, I think, there's been a sort of missing stair element where it's been kind of known and kind of accepted, but I think not necessarily we've been challenging these issues as much as we could or should. And I don't know about you, I'm kind of an optimistic person, but I'm hopeful that after having had, as you said, wave after wave, that I'm hopeful that eventually this stuff will stick. And we're seeing, I think, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, a kind of a lot more of statements of intent, particularly coming through the publishing industry and the work that I think it was the bookseller has done about structural issues within the publishing industry. And it starts to feel like it's becoming more well known, but whether we will actually fix it, I'm hopeful, but I don't know.
I will say that people hate hypocrisy more than they hate racism, and I know that sounds weird, but I genuinely it seems to have borne out in like last few years that when a company does something awful and they low-key do something awful for a very long time, usually in a structural, systemic way, and then they finally put out a thing saying we're totally not racist, and then people go, aha, but all these things you've done, and then the momentum builds because we hate hypocrites more than we hate racists. So the galvanizing moment always seems to be when we've kind of tricked them into saying we're anti-racist, and then you're like, well, now we're going to get you. Here are we are with receipts, and it becomes this big internet drama and something kind of something almost looks like it's about to be done, and it's very uncomfortable to know that, or to notice that. And I'm very willing for people to tell me, no, actually that's not the pattern you're seeing. People do care, and I'd like to think that, but that's the uncomfortable thing I'm noticing in a lot of these conversations. But yeah, speaking of colonial history, Hong Kong's not doing great. Yeah, because that was the other big thing I brought up in my speech, that I think people kind of do forget, and that's very understandable in some ways, because I led with the Campbell thing, and but Hong Kong, I spent during the little kind of reception dinner, and we were chatting, I was just constantly on half an eye on Twitter checking what was happening in Hong Kong, because they were having a massive protest that day, and there were, and in Hong Kong, protesters get beat up a lot. At that time, it was, and a year ago, it was still shocking. A year ago, Hong Kong was still genuinely shocked by all that. So I was still kind of half checking the phone for all that. And now, a year later, everything has changed and nothing has changed. There is a national security law which will make, if I do make a speech, any speech I make will be very illegal this year if I mention Hong Kong, because the national security law against sedition and kind of applies to everyone everywhere at all times. And yeah, and nothing, and everything has changed in that sense, and nothing has changed in the sense that it's still the same police brutality and tear gas and fighting, and people are still tired. A lot more people are arrested, though. There is that. A lot more people are in.
It feels like it's something that's kind of, certainly from a UK perspective, that we have lost sight of, in part
Yeah.
because we've kind of focused inward and down and got ourselves very, very turned in on COVID implications and things that are a bit
Pandemics make the world
but there is
smaller.
a whole global context.
Yeah, like pandemics make the world smaller, I think. It's very easy to just sort of retreat into your borders, and you're cutting people off like very physically as well. Like, you know, there are also travel bans everywhere. It's harder to get places. People are, I remember seeing this tweet about how someone was like living somewhere in the north saying they were trying to make a kind of plot their journey to London without, you know, minimizing time on train and stuff. And they were like, oh, that's how the Victorians must have felt. It was very witty, which I'm butchering right now, but the world feels bigger, or rather my own world feels smaller. Everything just feels further away. And my own personal world has shrunk to like the 3 blocks I take my dog out for a walk in. And it's worrying because that makes certain people and certain governments more powerful, and it cuts us off from each other, and I'm scared. I'm just scared. I want to be full of hope and say, yes, things are changing finally, but I'm just scared and tired.
Yeah, it's a really tough time at the moment, and one of the things that has that I have been struggling with during all of this lockdown period is the loss of so many of the bits that I always call about the life part of my work-life balance. You know, my theatre trips, my book events have kind of fallen out of the diary because we cannot do those things right now because it's not safe for us to do. And I know one of the things that has been a big part of your life is live action role play, and that must have just completely
they're all everything is cancelled. Everything is super cancelled. There is people are finding new and exciting ways to LARP over Zoom, which is quite exciting. Some of which is leaning into the medium of Zoom. And some people who aren't. I think there's a game coming up where people are playing hackers, which I'm sure is going to be hilarious. There's another which is kind of based on Sense8, the Netflix series, where you're kind of all kind of connected to each other, but you get to, and then I think the plot is, I haven't played it, but the plot is gonna, you meet alternate versions of yourself, so it's one where you get your character given to you. Mm-hmm. But then over the course of the game, you meet other people who are basically also playing you, but not you, so you're kind of meeting alternate universe versions of yourself from the past, present, and future and stuff. And also of all the people you kind of bonded with in your like Sense8, the 8 people cells who are connected. So that sounds really cool. Like so they're cool stuff happening, but like, you know, I talk to like 3 people every day. It's not really.
Has LARP affected your writing? Because it's basically a big mass collaborative piece of storytelling and narrative construction, and it's a very, looks like an incredibly creative community from the outside. I'm not a LARPer, but I have friends who LARP, many friends who LARP, and it looks from the outside as a hugely creative community.
I think I played the Theologian for a very long time in in a live roleplay game. I've always been very into playing theologians. So if you ever want to know why I write so much theology in my books, that's where it comes from. They're very talky books. I say books. My writing is very talky. I try to trust that because I enjoy talking a lot, that people will want to hear my characters talk a lot. But yeah, a LARP really makes me very aware that every character has their own perspective, their own plan, their own schemes, and perhaps too much so. It makes me very hyper aware of that. It makes me I find it very hard to plot anything with too many characters. So what has really, really impacted my work is it meant that I wrote a very claustrophobic book with like 3 characters because I can't handle more. Because if I have more characters, they all have to have their own ridiculous schemes that they're trying to enact, and then the book will explode. I think I had a book which that happened to, where it just kind of, I had like 20 characters and just ground to a halt. I just couldn't write anymore because there were just too many people doing too many things and everything was happening too slowly. So there's that. there are a lot of little Easter eggs in LARP that come from LARP. The wasp waste scene is kind of semi based on a character from a live roleplay game ran years ago called Maelstrom, which had a lot of colonial themes. It had a giant insect person queen from a hive, because insect people were a thing in that setting. Adrian Tchaikovsky also played in that game, so I mean, I think he likes insects also, and arachnids and so forth as well in general, but he also played in that game, and there are also references to Maelstrom in his work. But that's my homage to Maelstrom, that a wasp queen having tea with you and being extremely uncomfortable is an experience I had at that LARP. So I've kind of put it in. So there are a lot of little things like that. I think it's more likely for me that little moments I've experienced in LARP end up kind of winding their way into my text. And I'd like to think that it gives me a certain, a very textual, tangible, physical perspective to a lot of the stuff that wouldn't necessarily occur to me otherwise. But that's because I have a very shitty imagination. I'm very bad at making things up. So when I've been in a giant dress, I can go, yep, turns out petticoats, that's how they feel like, and then I can try and describe that in a way that my very shitty imagination wouldn't be able to conjure that. But that's kind of my stance in general, that reality is, my imagination just isn't very good. So when I'm trying to write something, I'll try to adapt it from something I know or have experienced or have read. Because otherwise my brain will default to kind of very boring, essentialist, and white, because much of my education is very white. Very, like, I grew up in the colony of Hong Kong, so, you know, it's all, I grew up reading kind of very white literature, and like, you know, I grew up reading a lot of fairy tales, and that's kind of where there are patterns in my brain. They're kind of almost like ruts. And the only way I know to break out of that is to read something else and steal it. Or to have experienced something else and steal that. And I find that in fantasy, in science fiction, sometimes because we love the genre so much, we end up only looking within the genre for our inspirations. Like, there are sometimes you read a fantasy battle scene and it feels like this person has read every other fantasy battle scene out there, but nothing outside of that. And that's not bad. Like, it's not inherently worthless or terrible, or this isn't even bad writing, but this, at some point, it feels like you're making leftovers out of someone else's leftovers, which were made from someone else's leftovers, and it's just kind of photocopies of photocopies.
That very closed.
But leftovers are also delicious. They are.
And sometimes you can plan for leftovers and make some really great meals. But it limits. I can see what you're saying. It kind of limits the things that you can work with, yeah. And it's hard to do new stuff.
Yeah, and I think that we have some bad habits in fantasy, and how we talk about and how we analyze and how we look at things. Like, and it's not that other disciplines don't have this. Like, oh heavens, how people read the Brontes is just a nightmare. So it's not like, you know, we're the only guilty people in the room. Everyone does some version of this. But like, it just what people call hard and soft sci-fi is, if you think about it for more than 3 seconds, is just mind-boggling. And I've had loads of people kind of defend, like, sit in front of me and it's like, no, hard sci-fi is hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi is soft. Like, so hard sci-fi can't be based on the social sciences or biology or geology. That'd be ridiculous. And it's sort of like, can you? Okay, sure. And it's like, you know, geology, excuse me. And a lot of that comes from, you know, and like, you know, the hard soft sci-fi thing comes from Campbell's own kind of ideas, like his what he found correct and what he liked as good and bad science, rather than anything that is based on, like, what isn't science. And it's weird. Like, we will, and there are plenty of engineers who hate a lot of his like early work, like, you know, make Ali, like talk to Aliette about cold equations, for example. Aliette de Bodard has very strong opinions about that, which is one of the early stories that he edited, for example. Because there's a certain outlook there, and we keep saying that's the one that our genre should be based in, and I don't think that works.
Putting those false limits around what we think is acceptable and not is just a horribly limiting thing when we live in a world and environment that's capable of so many diverse stories.
Yeah, and you know, taxonomically, I appreciate why you want to create little boxes to talk about things, because, you know, you talk about things by putting things that are similar together. So I understand that, you know, genres need labels, and we can't just kind of roll around what some people do and very successfully just roll around in this giant heap of books. But, you know, again, I'm an academic.
When I win the lottery, I'm totally doing that.
But like, you know, I understand why genre taxonomy is important, but where we draw those lines and how we draw those lines are very deeply rooted in our own biases, and it's always uncomfortable to look at. And we
are talking to ourselves. So I can ask you one last question before we draw this to a close, because we had a really kind of rich conversation. So what's next for you?
So I'm doing what people generally call, I'm in the phase known as the troubled second album. So my plan was that I was going to be drunk in a hotel room in Wales, covered in feathers, and just wake up with a perfect manuscript. That was my plan. Unfortunately, I can't be in Wales right now, and I'm also teetotal, so but I am writing something. I am writing something, and I'm doing a little bit of freelance work on the side, which is not very important. I've been doing a couple of articles here and there, but yeah, like there was a novel in the works. It's about making art during the apocalypse, which seems a bit prophetic, but I promise you I started it forever ago. And hopefully it'll be finished in the next 6 months. But I feel like it's something completely different, except for the fact it's also very claustrophobic and has like 3 characters, because I can't handle big casts. That may also be a lie, I don't know. I'm 50k in. That's a lie too. I'm not 50k in. I want to be 50k in.
Well, if there's one
sorry, I was probably all too honest.
Yeah. Don't tell your agents and your editors that with them. But if there's one thing that I think I've been learning through this awful time, that with all of this that we are living through at the moment, is the importance of art. You know, it's definitely it's been books and things like that have been getting me through all of this. So that sounds like it's going to be a timely and prophetic book, even if it wasn't intended to be.
Or not at all. I don't know. I just want to finish it right now. It's Asian fantasy, and so far that is a genre which I have too many emotions about, because you know, being East Asian, I like my family want me to write something that's Asian fantasy. But I also have a weird relationship with Chinese history, so it will is it even done? Maybe I'll just delete it tomorrow. It'll be fine.
Well, good luck with it, wherever it goes, whether it's the finishing it or the hitting the delete key and starting something else. It's been fantastic to have the chance to chat to you, and thank you so much for
letting me
time for this. So I'm gonna leave that there and say thank you to everyone who has been keeping on tuning in to our YouTube channel during lockdown, and thank you to everyone, all of the writers who have been helping us out by giving us their time and their creativity and sharing things, whether it's bits of insight, readings from their books, shelfies, cosplay ideas, sword fighting reenactments, everything else. It's been an utter joy to have you all and to be hosting you as part of this series, and I hope it's been bringing a little bit of joy into people's lives during lockdown. I'm still hopeful that the COVID-19 threat will recede enough that we can get back to meeting in person at some point soon, because that would be wonderful, because I am definitely missing SRFC in my life. So hopefully we'll get to see each other soon. So thanks.
I look forward to licking all your faces.
And on that note, thank you. Bye-bye. I have... Oh.